The silent witness. Sarah had always felt safe in her own home. The small apartment in the heart of the city, though modest, had been her sanctuary. It was quiet, private, a place where she could escape the chaos of her demanding job and the endless noise of the world outside. But lately, things had begun to change. It started with the feeling of being watched. At first it was subtle, an inexplicable shiver down her spine when she entered a room, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end as if someone were there, just out of sight. She would glance over her shoulder, only to find the apartment as empty as it had been before. But the feeling persisted, creeping into every corner of her life, lurking just beyond the edge of her awareness. Then one night she saw him. It was late, and Sarah was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, when she noticed a figure standing outside her window. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, the shadows playing tricks on her tired eyes. But as she squinted, she saw him more clearly. A man, tall and thin, standing motionless in the darkness. His face was obscured by the shadows, but she could feel his eyes on her, piercing through the glass. She jumped to her feet, her heart racing. The man didn't move, didn't react. He simply stood there, watching her. Panic surged through her, and she rushed to the door, locking it behind her. She peered through the peephole, but there was no sign of him. The street outside was empty, the usual bustle of the city long gone for the night. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination running wild. But the next night, he was there again, and the night after that. Each time he stood in the same spot, staring at her with those cold, unblinking eyes. He never moved, never spoke. He simply watched. Sarah tried to ignore him at first, convincing herself that it was just a coincidence. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive. She couldn't shake the sense that he was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to make a mistake. One evening, unable to bear the tension any longer, Sarah decided to confront him. She gathered her courage, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside into the darkened street. The night air was thick with an unnatural stillness, the usual sounds of the city muffled as if the world had fallen silent just for her. She walked to the spot where she had seen him standing, but there was no one there. The street was empty, the shadows stretching long across the pavement. She stood there for a moment, her breath shallow, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. But the man was gone. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As she turned to head back to her apartment, she caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of her eye. He was standing across the street, just at the edge of the shadows, watching her with those same unblinking eyes. He hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. A chill ran down Sarah's spine, and she quickly hurried back inside, locking the door behind her. She felt trapped, her own home no longer a sanctuary, but a prison. The walls seemed to close in around her, the silence suffocating. The next few days passed in a blur. Sarah couldn't focus on anything. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't shake the feeling that he was always watching. Every time she stepped outside, every time she walked through her apartment, she could feel his presence just beyond her reach. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, and she began to see him in every corner, every reflection. It was as though he was everywhere and nowhere at once, always just out of sight, but never truly gone. One night, as she sat on the couch, her eyes fixed on the door, she heard a soft knock. Her heart skipped a beat. She stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a faint scratching sound like nails dragging across wood. Trembling, she moved toward the door, her hand hovering over the lock. She had to know. She had to see if he was there. She opened the door just a crack, peering through the narrow gap. But there was no one there. The hallway outside was empty, as quiet as the grave. She stepped outside cautiously, her heart racing in her chest. The building was silent, the air heavy with the weight of her fear. And then, from the darkness, he stepped forward. The man was closer than ever, standing just inches away, his face still obscured by shadows. He didn't speak, didn't move. He simply stood there, staring at her with those cold, lifeless eyes. Sarah backed away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. But as she leaned against the door, trying to steady her shaking hands, she realized something terrifying. The figure had never spoken. He had never made a sound, but somehow she knew he was communicating with her. His presence, his gaze, it all spoke volumes. He was not the uninvited guest. The evening had been perfect, or so I thought. The table was set with care. The candles flickered softly in their holders, casting a warm, inviting glow across the room. I had spent hours preparing the meal: roast chicken, fresh bread, a decadent chocolate cake for dessert. The wine was chilled, the atmosphere just right for an intimate dinner with friends. My husband, Daniel, had gone out earlier to pick up a few last-minute items, leaving me alone to finish setting up. As the minutes ticked by, I could hear the soft hum of conversation from the kitchen as I arranged the place settings. It had been some time since we had hosted a dinner party, and I was eager to reconnect with our closest friends. We had all been so busy with work, with life, that it felt like an eternity since we had gathered like this. The first guests arrived just as I was placing the final touches on the table. There was Jane, our old college friend, with her bright smile and easy laugh. Then Robert and Sarah, who had been our neighbors for years. The conversation flowed easily as we shared stories, exchanged jokes, and enjoyed the meal I had so carefully prepared. But as the evening wore on, something began to feel off. It was subtle at first, a strange unease that settled in the pit of my stomach. The doorbell rang unexpectedly, breaking the rhythm of our conversation. Daniel was still in the kitchen, and I stood up to answer it, assuming it was someone arriving late. When I opened the door, I was met with a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, with dark, penetrating eyes, and a face that seemed both familiar and foreign. His clothes were old-fashioned, worn, but not in a way that suggested poverty. He looked like someone who had stepped out of another time, another place. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "I believe I've been invited." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I'm sorry, but I don't believe we're expecting anyone else." The man smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a chill down my spine. "Ah, but you are. You just don't remember." Before I could protest, he stepped inside, brushing past me with a sense of authority that made me feel strangely powerless. My guests, who had been laughing and chatting moments before, fell silent, their eyes widening as the man entered the room. "Who is this?" Jane asked, her voice laced with confusion. "I'm afraid I wasn't properly introduced," the man said, his gaze flicking to each of us. "But I know all of you. And I know you, Claire." My blood ran cold at the mention of my name. How did he know me? I had never seen him before in my life. "Please," I said, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "You must be mistaken. We're in the middle of a dinner party. I don't know who you are." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to the table, his eyes scanning the room as though he were taking inventory of the scene. "You don't recognize me, but I know you. I know all about you, Claire. All the things you've tried to forget." My heart skipped a beat. I felt a strange sense of dread wash over me, and I could see that my guests were growing uneasy as well. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Sarah exchanged a nervous glance with Jane. The man turned his gaze back to me, his eyes narrowing with an unsettling intensity. "You've tried so hard to bury the past, haven't you? But it's not so easily forgotten, is it?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What are you talking about?" "You don't remember, do you?" he asked, his voice now a low whisper, as though he were savoring the moment. "You don't remember the things you did, the people you hurt, the lives you destroyed." A chill ran down my spine, and I felt my legs grow weak. I stumbled back, my mind racing, but I couldn't remember what he was talking about. What had I done? What was he accusing me of? "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "I am someone from your past," he said, his smile widening. "Someone you thought you could forget, but I've come to remind you." The room seemed to close in around me. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I felt as though I were drowning in the weight of his words. I had no idea who this man was, but the way he spoke, the way he looked at me, it was as though he knew everything about me, everything I had ever done. "You can't hide from the truth forever, Claire," he continued, his voice almost a hiss. "The sins of your past are not so easily erased. They follow you, waiting to drag you back into the darkness." I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. I could hear my guests murmuring in the background, their voices growing more frantic as the man's words sank in. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body felt frozen, as though I were trapped in some nightmare I couldn't escape. The man stepped closer to me, his eyes gleaming with a strange satisfaction. "You thought you could move on, didn't you?" Whispers in the walls. I had always been a man of reason, a man who relied on logic and science to navigate the world. I had never been one to believe in the supernatural or the inexplicable. But that was before I moved into the old apartment on Fifth Avenue. The building itself was a relic of a bygone era, its once grand facade now weathered and cracked with age. The landlord, an elderly woman named Mrs. Davenport, had warned me that the place was full of character, but I didn't mind. I was looking for something affordable, and the apartment was exactly what I needed: spacious, quiet, and within walking distance of my office. The first few days passed without incident. The apartment creaked and groaned as old buildings do, but nothing out of the ordinary. It wasn't until the third night, just as I was settling into bed, that I first heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, or perhaps the building settling, but the whispers were too distinct, too deliberate. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the walls, soft but clear, like a voice barely above a whisper calling my name. "David." I froze. My name. It was unmistakable, but there was no one there. The apartment was empty, save for me. I stood up, my heart pounding, and pressed my ear against the wall. The whispers continued, but now they were more insistent, more urgent. "David, come closer." I pulled away from the wall, my mind racing. I had to be imagining it. Perhaps it was the building's old plumbing, the pipes rattling in the walls. I dismissed it, climbed back into bed, and tried to sleep. But the whispers returned. Every night they grew louder, more persistent. Sometimes they were faint, like distant murmurs. Other times, they were as clear as if someone were standing right next to me. They always called my name, always beckoned me to listen, to come closer. And each time, I resisted. But as the days went by, I began to feel the weight of the whispers pressing on me, like a shadow that never left. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't concentrate on anything. My sleep became fitful, and I found myself growing more and more exhausted. The whispers were driving me mad, and I had to know what was causing them. One evening, I decided to investigate. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Armed with a flashlight, I began to search the apartment, starting with the walls. I tapped along the plaster, listening for any hollow spots that might indicate a hidden space. I found nothing unusual, just the normal sounds of an old building. But as I moved through the apartment, the whispers followed me. They seemed to shift, moving from one wall to another, always just out of reach. "David, come closer." I followed the sound, moving down the narrow hallway that led to the small closet in the corner of the apartment. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. They seemed to be coming from behind the closet wall. I pressed my ear to the cold plaster, my breath shallow. "David, you must know." My hand trembled as I reached for the closet door. It creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit space. But as I stepped inside, something caught my eye. Something strange. A faint, yellowed stain on the floor near the base of the wall. It looked like old, dried blood. My stomach churned. I had to know what was behind that wall. I grabbed a crowbar from the toolbox I kept in the corner of the room and began prying at the plaster. It came away easily, revealing a hidden cavity behind the wall. My heart raced as I pulled more of the wall apart, revealing a small, dark space. And then I saw it. A small wooden box, old and weathered, sat in the corner of the cavity. The whispers grew louder, more frantic as I reached for it. I hesitated, my fingers trembling, but something compelled me to open it. As I lifted the lid, a cold, foul odor wafted up from the box, and I recoiled. Inside, there were scraps of old newspaper, yellowed with age, and what appeared to be a bundle of letters tied together with a fraying piece of string. I pulled them out, my hands shaking, and began to read. The letters were written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. They spoke of a family that had lived in the building decades ago, a family that had disappeared without a trace. The whispers, it seemed, had always been there, haunting the walls of the building, waiting for someone to listen. But as I read further, the truth began to emerge, a truth far darker than I could have ever imagined. The family had been involved in something unspeakable, something that had bound their souls to the very walls of the building. And now, their spirits were trapped, unable to move on, forever whispering to those who dared to listen. The letters spoke of a ritual, a dark and twisted ritual that had been performed in the very apartment I now lived in. The family had sacrificed their own flesh and blood to open a doorway to another realm, a realm of darkness and suffering. The rotted heart. Claire Whitaker had always been a woman of strength. A successful businesswoman, she had built her life on discipline and control, never letting emotions cloud her judgment. But when a sudden, debilitating heart condition left her weak and desperate, she had no choice but to rely on the kindness of a stranger. The transplant, a procedure she had once thought unimaginable, was her only hope. She received a new heart, one that promised to save her life. The surgery was a success. Claire awoke in the sterile, white hospital room, weak but alive. The doctors assured her that the recovery would take time, but she would be fine. However, as the days passed, something strange began to happen. Claire felt different, as though the heart inside her chest wasn't truly hers. It was as if it belonged to someone else, someone with a life far darker than her own. At first, the changes were subtle. She began having vivid dreams, dreams filled with images of a woman, someone she didn't recognize, standing in a dark, fog-covered alley. The woman's face was obscured, but her eyes burned with a hollow, desperate longing. Claire woke up in a cold sweat, her pulse racing, but she thought nothing of it. Stress from the surgery, perhaps, or the medication. It would pass. But then the cravings started. Claire found herself drawn to things she had never had any interest in before. raw meat, blood-red wine, and even the faint scent of decay that seemed to linger in the corners of her apartment. At first, she dismissed it as a side effect of the transplant, but as the cravings grew stronger, she couldn't ignore them. It wasn't just hunger, it was something deeper, something primal. The visions became more frequent too. She would be sitting at her desk at work or walking down the street, and suddenly the world around her would blur. The woman from her dreams would appear before her face now clear and twisted in agony, her mouth open as if to scream. And then Claire would hear it, the faint whisper of a name. Evelyn. The name echoed in her mind, a name she had never heard before, but one that felt so familiar. It gnawed at her, pulling her into a world she couldn't escape. The more she searched for answers, the more she realized that the heart she had received belonged to someone named Evelyn, a woman who had died under mysterious circumstances. Claire visited the hospital, hoping to find information about her donor, but the records were sealed. The staff seemed evasive, as if they were hiding something. The more she pressed, the more she felt as though the walls were closing in on her, as though the very air she breathed was thick with secrets. The name Evelyn haunted her every waking moment, and the visions grew more intense, more violent. She began to hear whispers in the dead of night, whispers that spoke of betrayal, murder, and a terrible price that had been paid. One evening, Claire could no longer ignore the pull. She sought out the address of Evelyn's family, convinced that the answers she sought lay in the woman's past. When she arrived at the dilapidated house, the air was thick with decay, the windows boarded up, the door hanging off its hinges. She stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what she would find. The house was abandoned, but it was far from empty. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn hastily in what looked like blood. The air was heavy with the scent of rotting flesh, and as Claire explored further, she found a room at the back of the house. It was here that she uncovered the truth. Evelyn had been involved in a cult, a dark, twisted group that believed in the power of human sacrifice. They had used her heart in a ritual, hoping to harness its power to summon a malevolent force. But the ritual had gone horribly wrong, and Evelyn had died in agony, her heart torn from her chest before her time. The cult had disbanded, leaving the house to rot, but Evelyn's soul had never left. Her heart had been stolen, and it had found its way into Claire's chest. The realization hit Claire like a bolt of lightning. She was no longer just Claire Whitaker. She was Evelyn, her soul, her desires, her darkness, intertwined with Claire's own. The cravings, the visions, the whispers, they were all Evelyn's, and now Claire was bound to her. The heart inside her chest was not just a donor organ. It was a conduit, a link to the horrors of Evelyn's past. As Claire stood in the decaying house, the temperature dropped, and the shadows seemed to close in around her. The woman from her visions appeared once more, her eyes now filled with malice, her lips curling into a twisted grin. "You can't escape me," Evelyn's voice whispered, her words a rasp that echoed through Claire's mind. "You are mine now." Claire's breath caught in her throat and she turned to flee, but the shadows followed her, wrapping around her like a suffocating cloak. She could feel the darkness inside her growing. The shadows beneath the bed. When Evelyn and I decided to move into the old house on Maple Street, we thought we were embarking on a new chapter of our lives. One filled with hope, a fresh start, and the excitement of a place to call our own. The house, a Victorian relic with peeling paint and overgrown ivy, stood at the edge of town, its looming silhouette casting long shadows across the street. It was affordable, charming in its own way, and most importantly, it was ours. The first few days were filled with the usual tasks of settling in. unpacking boxes, hanging pictures, and choosing the right spots for furniture. The house creaked with the sounds of age, but nothing out of the ordinary. The floors groaned underfoot, the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and the air smelled faintly of dust and forgotten memories. But it was the master bedroom that caught my attention. The bed, a large four-poster with heavy, ornate carvings, dominated the room. It was antique, like the house itself, and I couldn't help but feel an odd sense of unease every time I looked at it. The frame was solid, the sheets crisp, and yet there was something about the space beneath it that unsettled me. It was as though the shadows there were deeper, darker than anywhere else in the room. Evelyn, ever the optimist, dismissed my concerns with a laugh. "It's just an old house, Tom. You're letting your imagination run wild." But I wasn't so sure. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something that was waiting. And the longer we stayed, the more I began to sense its presence. It started subtly. At night, I would hear faint rustling sounds coming from beneath the bed. At first, I chalked it up to the house settling, to the wind whispering through the cracks. But then, the noises became more distinct, soft, scraping sounds, as though something was moving in the dark. I would lie awake, my heart pounding, straining to hear over the steady rhythm of Evelyn's breathing. But when I glanced at the bed, the shadows beneath it remained still, silent. Evelyn, of course, heard nothing. She would smile and roll over, content in her dreams. But I couldn't escape the sensation that something was lurking, something that was feeding off my unease. Then came the dreams. At first, they were nothing more than vague nightmares, flickering images of shadows moving in the corners of my vision, whispers that seemed to echo from the darkness. But as the nights wore on, the dreams grew more vivid, more real. I would wake in a cold sweat, my heart racing, my breath shallow, and each time I would find myself staring at the space beneath the bed, my eyes drawn to the blackness that seemed to grow deeper with every passing night. One evening, I couldn't take it any longer. I had to know what was beneath that bed. I had to see it for myself. I waited until Evelyn had fallen asleep, her steady breathing filling the silence of the room. Slowly, I slipped out of bed and knelt down, my hand trembling as I reached toward the edge of the frame. The air beneath the bed was thick, heavy with an oppressive stillness. I held my breath, peering into the darkness. And then I saw it. A pair of eyes, gleaming, yellow, and full of malice, stared back at me from the depths. They were too large, too wide, and they seemed to be watching me with an intelligence that sent a cold shiver down my spine. I jerked back, my heart hammering in my chest, but the eyes did not move. They simply watched, unblinking, unyielding. I stumbled back to the bed, my mind racing, my body shaking. I couldn't explain what I had seen, but I knew, deep down, that whatever was beneath that bed was not just a figment of my imagination. It was real. The next morning I tried to tell Evelyn, but she only laughed it off. "You're just stressed, Tom. Maybe you're working too much. You need to relax." But I couldn't relax. I couldn't forget the eyes, the feeling of being watched. And as the days passed, the presence beneath the bed grew stronger. The shadows seemed to stretch further into the room, as though they were reaching out inch by inch, pulling at the edges of our reality. That night I could feel it again, the presence. It was stronger now, more insistent, as though it was waiting for something. And then I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, crawling from the depths beneath the bed. "Come closer. We are waiting." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was not human. It was something else, something ancient, something malevolent. I could feel its hunger, its desire to feed on my fear, to consume me whole. I tried to ignore it, to close my eyes and pretend it wasn't real, but the voice grew louder, more urgent. "Come closer. We are waiting for you." Evelyn stirred beside me, her eyes fluttering open. "Tom, what's wrong?" I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. I couldn't explain it to her. How could I? How could I tell her that something was beneath?